Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to CRAM. Thanks for joining me as we explore new and innovative research and big ideas that may actually change the way you think and act. What are you going to do with your hair? Sure, I ask that question to myself now and then, but I discovered that it doesn't carry the same weight, the same significance as it does with many women who are Black. The question of hair can be monumental for them. This is what I discovered when I read a book by Cheryl Thompson. She's a Black woman who's an assistant professor in the School of Performance at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly known as Ryerson. She spent 9 years researching Black beauty culture in Canada and the political, social, and economic implications around it. And it's a story that's close to Cheryl's heart. It ended up as a book called Beauty in a Box, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture. And it's a story that encompasses not just a professional journey, but a personal one for her as well. Cheryl joins me. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, let me just start off first and talk about that question, which I mentioned in the introduction. What am I going to do with my hair? Like, why is that such, I said monumental. It also can be a super loaded question. Like, what does that mean to a Black woman, or what can it mean?
Yeah, I think it means different things at different stages of your life. Mm-hmm. And I think when you're in school, so when you're a young person, it means not getting in trouble, not getting expelled, or, not people understanding why you might not be participating in gym class, not because you're lazy, but maybe because you don't want to get your hair wet, because then you have to go back to class and your hair is not going to look presentable. And while that sounds frivolous, it isn't when you're 14 and 15. Bullying is real. So, those questions, I gave a talk a few months ago. This was actually very eye-opening for me, even having written a book. And it was a talk to, I can't remember the full name, but it was basically a children's aid society that deals with kids who are going through adoption or foster families. Something I had never thought about. Imagine if you are a Black child that gets fostered into a white home, they don't know what to do with your hair. And often some of the experiences that young girls have in the foster system is that white families think that they have poor hygiene because we don't wash our hair every day. We don't use certain products. So the foster parent was interpreting that as the child not being raised properly and having hygiene issues. And so imagine you're that child who gets fostered into that white home. Every day you're asking yourself, what am I going to do with my hair? Because you can't talk to your foster parent about it. And they're forcing certain practices on you that are not indigenous to your culture. And if you take those practices on, you're actually going to lose your hair, because Black hair can't be washed every day. And also Black hair can't be manipulated, i.e. just touched and pulled. And it's just not, our hair texture is different. If you treat Black hair that way, it will start to fall out. So,
and that's a big deal, isn't it? Among many Black women, about hair falling out.
So imagine you're 16 and your hair falls out.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do with your hair? And so that when you get a bit older, the dynamic even starts to shift. Then it's, say you've met a man, if you're a heterosexual woman, say you've met a man and he's like a corporate guy and you're a natural person and he likes you, but the question of your hair actually might come up where he says, are you going to do something with your hair? Because I have a big event that I'm going to and you can't wear your hair like that.
Like that meaning what? Natural.
Oh, natural. So maybe it's an afro, maybe it's twists. What he means to say is that he wants your hair to look like the other women who are there, so long and straight. So that's what he's really trying to say, but he might not say it that way. So then suddenly you might be in your 30s thinking, okay, what am I going to do? Because I don't want to wear my hair that way, but I really like this person. So then you have that moral dilemma. And then there's the older Black woman who might be, could even be in her senior age, who has been maybe processing their hair for 40 years or wearing a wig or a weave. And suddenly they're like, what am I going to do with my hair? I can't keep wearing a wig. I'm 80. So even the 70, 80-year-old Black woman might still be asking this same question because,
Yeah.
and at that age, it's about care. Like, how do I physically
Mm-hmm.
care for a straightened hair aesthetic requires a lot of maintenance.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to stop you there because I want to go back historically because, just even the idea of having your hair straight, as you said, right? How that even came to be. How is it that so many Black women adopted this idea of having straight hair? And also, let's get into skin, right? Because you really talk a lot about that too, about lightening skin. Can you take us back and when was all that introduced? How
Well,
did that happen?
yeah, I mean, one of the reasons in this book that I realized that I had to understand European culture. I had to
Mm-hmm.
understand European culture to write about Black culture as it relates to beauty. Because if you think about, and this topic obviously too is very intimately tied with transatlantic slavery. So if we think about the centuries of transatlantic slavery, so from the 15th century really until the 19th century, if we go to the 15th century, what were people doing in Europe? I mean, they were wearing wigs, white wigs, right? People were covering their actual hair and wearing wigs. And as you go through, and this is, a lot of this didn't get into the book. I talk more about this in my dissertation, which the book was. I actually went into more detail talking about sumptuary laws. So sumptuary laws were basically codes of conduct. Prior to the 20th century, sumptuary laws determined what people could wear based on their rank. So the peasant actually had to dress as a peasant. They couldn't dress up. They could be punished you couldn't dress as royalty. You had to dress as a peasant. So if you think about the rules and conduct of those centuries, they were very defined. Now
Mm-hmm.
insert a Black person into that setting with quote unquote kinky, curly, tightly coiled hair, and you're also enslaved. And the plantation or the slave master, we had slavery in Canada. We didn't have plantations, but we have masters and misses in Canada. You're in their homes. They want you to look like them. They demand that you look like them. So the house servant is essentially forced to wear a wig also. Over time, that wig ain't so bad. Over time, that wig gets you into the house, gets you to speak to certain people, gets you treated a certain way, avoids the negative stereotypes that are now attached to the Black body that's working out in the fields. Having your hair presentable now means that you can actually move up in the world and people will talk to you in a certain way. And so over time, that dichotomy, it just never really went away, right? Madam C.J. Walker, who was the African-American woman who Self-Made is the Netflix movie that came out in 2020 about Madam C.J. Walker. She revolutionized Black hair care in the early 20th century because she essentially said, you don't have to be she was criticized because she encouraged people to straighten their hair, Black women, but she really wasn't encouraging them to adopt a white aesthetic. What she was saying is that your hair could be healthy, because what we don't realize is that really up until mid to late 20th century, vitamin D and C and beta carotene deficiencies were very real across the world. And especially in Black women had suffered from a lot of vitamin D deficiency. So our hair would fall out. Imagine in being a grown woman in the late 19th century as a woman, you could have patches of hair missing, and just the embarrassment and the low self-esteem, which is what led to a lot of women just wrapping their hair. Some of that was for aesthetic reasons. Some of that was to basically hide what was a disarray in terms of hair care. Madam C.J. Walker created products that actually helped Black women's hair grow. Like, she called it magical hair grower. They were naturally made products that created a sense of self-esteem finally. And yes, the products also were tied to what was known as the shampoo, press, and curl method of hair care, where they gave you the product, shampooed your hair, put the product in, and then she did with a hot comb straighten out the hair. And so she got a lot of criticism from, church leaders and some political leaders who said, oh, she's encouraging Black women to adopt European aesthetics. But they just, for my opinion, they read it wrong. What she was doing was saying, have pride in yourself and love yourself.
Yeah, that's so interesting that, in your deep dive into all this, you can see sort of these subtleties and these differences of interpretation, right? I see what you're saying. What I find interesting too is that with that woman developing this line of products, she was also giving I guess, in a sense, the power of control now back to the woman to do her own hair, right?
Yes, because at one point she employed thousands of Black women. She didn't just do their hair. She employed them. She gave them opportunity to not be a domestic, a laundress, a maid, a servant. She created an entirely different economic opportunity for thousands of Black women. And by the way, her company still exists to this day. It was passed on through her niece, and it was just passed on, and she had a structure in place. What happened is that the 1960s civil rights movement changed everything. It just remapped the idea of, well, it questioned, really for the first time, what is presentable? Is presentable really code for acquiescing to white people? Isn't that what being presentable actually means?
Yeah, well, because, and again, just going back, I mean, in your book, when you talk about the early 20th century and what was going on, the sense I got from what you were saying is that Black women were bombarded with these messages, either in magazines or in newspapers about looking more like white women, about having straight hair, about using these skin lighteners. Isn't that right? Isn't that the message that
Yeah, that was the message. And it was kind of everywhere. It was even in the church newspapers, like religious newspapers, Black community, you name it.
Oh, speaking of, I'm glad you brought that up. I'd never heard this. You had this section about the whole relationship between Black beauty interpreted by Christianity. And you said that there were some churches, and I'm assuming these ones were in the U.S., where they had this brown paper bag ritual and a comb. Comb in the church. Okay, just tell me.
It's the paper bag and the comb test. So the comb test would be like they would hang like a steel tooth comb, otherwise known to today as like a pick. It would kind of be like a pick. And if it got stuck in it, then you couldn't attend the church because your hair was too thick. Hair was too nappy, quote unquote, you couldn't attend church. So the paper brown bag test was they would have various hues of bags. And basically, they would have the one bag, sorry. Okay. And if your skin tone was darker than the bag, then you were denied entry into the service. Only the people who were the bag and lighter. And now understand, it sounds crazy, doesn't it? But understand the context. We're dealing with, this was actually happening in the northern American cities, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, the cities that had experienced what's known as the Great Migration. So when hundreds of thousands of African Americans following the Civil War and Reconstruction migrated from the South to the North and built communities. And at the same time, because of the legacy of slavery, you had an entire, what they would have called quote unquote mulatto population, who basically were mixed raced Black people. Because of the relations of slavery, they had a white ancestor. So their skin was lighter. And because of that white ancestor, their hair was just naturally less coiled. It was just naturally straighter. This is the population that were more presentable. They got into the Harvards. They got into the Columbian universities. They got into all the universities. And because they then got university educated, they became wealthy. And when people become wealthy, they want to live with wealthy people. So they created wealthy Black communities. This is still Jim Crow America. But in Jim Crow America, there was actually a lot of Black wealth that was circulating Black communities. Because in those same Black communities, a lot of the really successful African Americans were the landlords of buildings. They actually owned the property in the Black community.
Oh, okay. So tell me this. Is this just kind of a self-perpetuating cycle then? Because what happens is if you're saying they were mulatto, so they were genetically, they're lighter skin, they maybe had straighter hair, they did well. And so then other Blacks see that they did well and they've got lighter skin and straighter hair. So, oh my goodness, maybe I should do that too.
That's right. But also they became the leaders in the community. They really did.
Right.
Like these are the people who entered go back, look at Thurgood Marshall. If you look at Thurgood Marshall, are like, oh, he's Black? Yeah, hard to tell. Yeah. You look through the 1940s and 50s of the African Americans who achieved great success.
Yeah.
They have a certain aesthetic about them. Even in Hollywood, Lena Horne, Dorothy Dandridge, they have a certain aesthetic about them that is quote unquote pleasing, which is the reason they were able to maneuver in those spaces compared to other actresses until the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement changed everything.
But I mean, pleasing in the sense of more of a white look, right? More of an Anglo.
Yeah. And pleasing, I just mean that just like the slave dynamic where they had you in the house because you look like them. That's what I mean by pleasing.
Yeah.
So you were in closer proximity to the white body. So it was easier to accept you as a person.
So that in the, I guess the first half of the 20th century, just how popular was straightening your hair and lightening your skin? How pervasive was it?
I mean, if you weren't, something was wrong. You would have been considered very strange. It really wasn't until, the truth is, even though we equate the natural hair movement with the 60s, it was actually the avant-garde art scene in New York City, like in the 50s, when people were hanging out in Greenwich Village and all that. And there was like this, that's actually when a lot of Black women were starting to go natural. Like there was like kind of the early the early folk scene before it became commercial was actually a very multicultural scene. But by the time it got commercial in the 60s, it was like all white. It was just white people. But that's not how it started. It started as a very eclectic kind of, not really hippie, but a bohemian lifestyle that a lot of people were taken up in the 50s. So that's really where it started. Okay. That's where it started. But before the 50s, it would have been very odd to see a Black woman with natural hair. Like very unusual. Like people would really look and say, what's going on?
But you know what? In the book too, you said, I can't remember when, but there was at one point where pretty much, I think most Black women had one of 4 different bob cuts. Like they were, maybe it was one of 4 different, and basically that was it. Yeah.
And if we think about Viola Desmond in Canada, she wore one of those bob cuts.
This is a great story. Could you please, I did not know this because, you think about, okay, Viola Desmond on the cover of our $10 bill. And, she stood up for in that racist incident and did not want to, said, I'm not going to leave this white section, of the theater. Yep. What I didn't realize is now you put her in the context of Black beauty culture.
Yeah.
Like talk about that.
Yeah. And just, for those who are interested, Viola Desmond is wearing what's known as a page boy hairdo. The page boy was very
you mean on the bill, the famous shot.
That dollar bill, the images that we see of her, it's a page boy haircut that was very popular through the 40s into the 50s. Like it was just a very popular look. Yeah. I mean, understand what happened to her at the theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. That was 9 years before Rosa Parks. Okay. Like that means Canada obviously has a history of Jim Crow segregation that we just don't really talk about because it wasn't on the books, right? It wasn't made legal. So Viola Desmond grew up in Nova Scotia at a time in Nova Scotia where everything was segregated. Like they couldn't even go to beauty school there. She had to go to New York. New York and Montreal, you could go, but in Nova Scotia, Black people were not admitted. You could even become a teacher. Her sister, who's recently passed away, wrote a book talking about Black teachers couldn't teach. If you wanted to be a teacher, you were not barred from teaching. So there were so many restrictions that she decided to create her own business for herself. And she married someone, her husband, who was a barber. So at one point, he had his barbershop and she had her beauty salon like right beside each other in the north end of Halifax, which is kind of amazing. And so she became kind of like a Madam C.J. Walker herself, where she had the beauty salon. Then she started training other women in hair preparation. And then she started making her own products. So the day that she was in New Glasgow, she was actually there selling her products door to door. That's what she was doing when her car broke down. And so then her going into the movie theater to watch that film, she was just killing time until her car was done. So you can imagine, and I actually gave a TIFF talk with TIFF, Toronto International Film Festival, where I talked about the film that she was watching, actually, because the film she was watching was a film noir kind of film. I can't remember the name of the film now, but the film was very interesting because it was about a woman wrongfully accused of doing something. That's the film she was watching when she was like,
oh my goodness. Yeah, doesn't art imitate life?
Yes, it does. So I can only imagine when she must have been like, is this really happening? Yeah.
But okay, see, what I thought was so interesting, though, is that you point out, you look at Viola Desmond, and she's got light skin, right? She's got that cut, which is very much, carefully coiffed, that page boy cut. How much of that, and because she was a successful businesswoman, how much of that played into her success? And it's so interesting because even though she's known, as being a heroine, to stand up against this kind of racism, she herself, you kind of allude to this, was partly able to succeed because she didn't conform to a typical sort of Black woman's look.
Well, no, I mean...
No? And that's kind of the sense, because if she had not straightened her hair, if she had had an afro, was very dark skinned, do you think she could have gotten to where she did?
No, she wouldn't have worn an afro in 1940s Halifax.
Okay.
No, maybe at home, but not in the street.
But do you know what I'm saying? How much did her conformity have to do with her doing well?
Well, the thing is, I don't want to make her too much of the exception, because the truth is she was the rule. Everybody, there was a Constance Backhouse, who was a legal scholar, writes about her as well. And it's, she was a part of a larger community where everyone was like that. Dr. Carrie Ann Best, who was editor of the Clarion, the other people that she was involved in the church. I mean, they all, Pearline Oliver and her husband, who were part of the church, and the Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which they all dressed that way. They all presented that way because it was a matter of their own safety, right? Yeah. And so you can imagine to live in that world where you're doing everything right, and it's like you still get accosted.
See, and so then with the 60s, and I mean, you did talk about sort of that bohemian movement and the arts, and that it was already starting, right? Already this kind of, let's go back to what's natural. What happened? Like, how did that momentum take hold?
I mean, in the book,
is that where the whole Black is Beautiful? Is that when that started to come out?
I sort of attribute it to the Panthers. The Black Panthers get framed as this like subversive and all the stuff, but the reality is they were just a pro-Black group who believed in, if you are going to actually create a place where everyone has full access to citizenship, we have to be able to show up as ourselves. Like, that's actually part of the citizenship conversation. The citizenship conversation can't be, I still have to conform to make you feel happy, and we're sitting on the bus together, but I have to wear this wig so you talk to me. That's actually not a full citizenship situation. And it's interesting, though, with the Panthers, because at the time when the Black Panthers arose in California, Ronald Reagan was governor. And so the Panthers had this whole thing where we are going to bear arms. The Second Amendment says that we can open carry in California. How interesting that Ronald Reagan changed the laws. When the Black Panthers started walking down the street, open carry with their guns, the laws were changed that you can't open carry in California anymore. And yet, this is just a parallel. Here we are, where suddenly everyone's acting like we have the right. And no, laws can be changed when it's a certain group of people who are taking up interpreting those laws in their favor, suddenly the laws have to change, right? So that speaks to the power that the Panthers had in the early 1960s. I would say, more power than Martin Luther King in Black community. At a certain point, by the mid to late 60s, Martin Luther King was starting to lose his grip on Black consciousness because there was too much death. Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, there's just too many people were being taken out, Sam Cooke, that people were just like, this nonviolence thing from 1955 and the bus boycotting, it's not enough. They're killing our leaders. And so the Black Panthers struck a consciousness in Black, and I'm talking about globally. Some say the Black Panthers are, connected to the independence movements that were even going on that started in Africa and then spread to the Caribbean. Because what they were really saying was, we as Black people have to emancipate ourselves from a level of oppression that we've been under. And it's not going to just happen with laws changing. We have to go through a personal transformation. And so that adoption of the Afro was about personal transformation. Like, you as an individual, you've shed that past page boy and you are now Black. And that's when they adopted the word Black to be an identity, not a skin color. Right. So it became an identity that because they realized it was the one thing that could unite Black people irrespective of citizenship, because citizenship rights really didn't seem like they were being offered. But Blackness, that's offered. That's something that we share.
Yes. And how prevalent would you say that feeling was? How pervasive was it in Canada at that time?
Oh, very. Because at that time, we also have our immigration wave from the Caribbean. So we have an immigration wave come from the Caribbean. And at that time in the Caribbean was still very much very British, even though emancipation had happened. Take Jamaica. Jamaica had its emancipation in 1962. There were still a lot of codes of conducts in terms of, wearing a wig to the office because it's professional, or flat ironing your hair, straighten out your hair, hot combing it because you got to wear that to go to work. So you had in Caribbean communities a little bit of this resistance to the natural. There was a resistance. Yeah. But by the time it just seemed like it was sweeping the globe, right? I mean, in the early 1970s, everybody was natural. Everybody, even Jewish people. Suddenly, Jewish people had a lot of curls in the 1970s. It's real.
Yeah.
If you go back and look at Jewish people in the 1970s, everybody had curls. Okay?
But again, see, it's so layered though. And this is what it made me think too, because even though the Afro became popular, you did say in the book that the impact though within families could spark a lot of intergenerational conflict.
Of course. So if you had a grandparent who was, came up in the 40s, of course, they would look at you and think, what a disgrace. You're a disgrace walking out in the street with your hair looking like that. How could that same grandparent by 1975, they probably went natural themselves. Because by then, like I say in the book, by then it was commercialized. All the beauty companies were going natural. All of them were coming out with products. By then, it wasn't just this radical movement. It was the industry had gone natural. But by 1978, 77, 78, they were like, no, you know what? Let's go back to straightening. It's fun. And they just reprogrammed everyone to get back into straightening their hair because the new thing was chemicals. Chemicals was the thing that's going to take you into the future. And everybody just bought that ad campaign.
Okay, so you're talking about what, new improved perms, that sort of thing?
Yeah, but it wasn't just that. It's like if you go back at aesthetic, it was a combination of aesthetic culture. I kind of talked a little bit about that. Fashion in the late 1970s had a big role to play. Suddenly, those especially magazine fashion stills. Yeah, you go back, honestly, those are some of the most beautiful women that ever lived. Okay. I look at women in fashion covers from the mid 70s to the early 80s. God, they just don't make women like that anymore. like I'm they had a certain elegance that was being presented, and straightening the hair was part of it. So it wasn't just the hair, and that's where the hair and the skin, it kind of got blurred, because those women were also, it was around the late 70s where suddenly there was less differentiation in skin tone. So it was kind of like the same skin tone, the same like body type, the same. Everyone had the straightened hair. The 80s was really big for like really blowing out the hair.
Yeah.
So everyone had like a mane of hair. Who's thinking about the afro at that time? It's like, it's just seeming so antiquated. If you're a young girl coming of age at that time, what is sexy? Sexy is not Angela Davis anymore. Angela Davis is angry. You don't want to be angry. What's sexy? Sexy is that beautiful model who is like, where, you know.
You talk about like that Farrah Fawcett kind of look.
Yeah, Studio 54 and the wrap dress, and everybody's on the disco dancing. I mean, go back and look at disco aesthetics. Nobody has an afro. No women have an afro. The disco era, Diana Ross even got that hair permed out. It was just the era where, but then paradoxically, there's always in Black culture, there's always a subculture, because that is the same era where Black women started to wear a lot of braids. So like braids were in the late 70s. Not so much the afro, but braids. Everybody was braiding their hair back then. Very common.
So that was the 70s. And then what's happened since then?
Well, now I think it's a little combination of everything. I mean, I think this century has proven itself, in my opinion, to not have any discernible style. Like, we can't pinpoint an aesthetic for each decade that we've experienced yet in the 21st century, right? The 80s had a look, the 90s had a look, the 70s had a look, 60s, 50s, 40s, 20s. All the decades of the 20th century had very discernible looks. There was a zeitgeist in terms of the aesthetic. In the 21st century, it's almost like we're like, you know what? The 20th century was amazing. Let's just pick anything. And any given day, you might see somebody wearing a bob. Somebody might have an afro. Somebody might, have their hair in pigtails. Like, it's kind of like anything goes.
Yeah. And if anything goes, generally speaking, do you think that's okay? Is that okay?
I mean, on some level, it probably seems a bit freer. Like, I feel like people seem a bit more free to make their own choices of whatever they want to do, right? Like, I wear my hair in locks. I'm not forced to wear my hair this way because it's nobody's going to accept me if I don't. Another Black woman, she might decide that she wants to wear a lace front wig. Funny story. When I moved to Montreal to do my PhD, and I came back, and the natural hair salon that I had used was no longer open, but the hairstylist had rented a chair at a salon in Yorkville. And so Yorkville is a really shishi part of Toronto. So I was already nervous. So I go to get my hair done, and he was great. He was always great. But it was just, I only went once, because the paradox, you're sitting in a salon where I'm getting my natural out of my scalp locks retwisted, and a Black woman beside me is getting her lace front wig tightened. I just was like, this is too much of a paradox for me. I'm out. Yeah, I'm out.
But I kind of wonder, though, I mean, when I think back about the days when you're saying, pretty much every woman straightened their hair because that's what was expected. That was the thing to do. They were lightening their skin. And then today, it's a choice. You're saying it's just a choice. And do you think that it is a conscious choice? Is it actually a conscious choice?
That's the debate. That's where I think it's still, yeah. I think there's still a lot of people wearing their hair certain ways to fit in, right? To be accepted, to get a job. I know in certain professions, like the legal profession, it is really hard to be too Afrocentric in the corporate world of Canada and America. It's really hard to be extremely Afrocentric. And what I mean by Afrocentric, I mean wearing aesthetics that are not just about clothing, but jewelry, not just about hair, sorry, but it's like jewelry, clothing that speak to the African diasporic experience. It can be a little difficult in the corporate world because countries of the diaspora tend to have an appreciation for really bright colors and patterns and textures and really big jewelry. So, really big earrings and really big necklaces. Those kinds of accessories just don't tend to be accepted very much in this quote unquote professional world.
Where do you think we've made the most progress when it comes to the Black beauty culture, you know?
I would say that it's a cultural thing. I would say, just generally speaking, we talk about our experiences a lot more. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't know that people were experiencing what I was experiencing because nobody really shared it. Like everybody kind of kept things to themselves. So I think that above everything else, this is a good era to be a young Black girl because you have so many more resources and people to support you as you go through the changes. And, you know, you just start questioning yourself. And I feel like every Black woman at a certain point has, you know, a come to Jesus moment, sort of, where they start to really ask themselves, am I doing the things that I'm doing for myself, or am I doing it for the external world? I mean, every Black woman I feel like they have that moment. It doesn't mean that they all go natural, but they do have that moment.
See, and I think that, I mean, when I listen to you saying that, and I'm sure a lot of other women and even men, I think we all actually have that moment, right?
Yes,
Am I doing this for, right? It's a universal kind of question.
It is a universal question. I was going to say that too. I just think with us, often it's around that issue. I think for other women, sometimes it's a bodily issue. Sometimes it's a speaking up. Like, am I speaking up or not speaking up? Like, right. And a lot of men too, you know, a lot of Black men, especially, they have the hair struggle too, because a professional Black man can't have an afro.
Yeah. I want to ask you, did researching, and I mean, it took you like 9 years, you worked on this. This really was a labor of love, but
I know, and the audience, if they're seeing this video, like, she looks so young. I know.
You do. But did researching and writing this book and, you know, just the voracious amount of you know, literature you read on this, like your head must be just like this with all the information, but all that, like, how did that change your own journey? How did this book, the creation of this book, change you?
Well, it made me realize that so many of my choices were because of an ad campaign that I had seen. You know, that was marketing. It's marketing, stupid. That we should all just put that on our foreheads. So many of my younger choices was basically just following the herd. Oh, everyone's using a relaxer. Oh, I guess I want one too. Oh, everyone's doing this. Like, everything was driven by the herd, what the masses were doing. And I think through the process of writing the book, even the way I end the book, there is a little bit of a call to action, a little bit of a, you know, until we change and until we see this. And I remember when the conclusion was pretty similar to my dissertation conclusion. There were edits and changes, but the last sentence was basically the same. And I remember one of my committee members at my defense were like, you know, do you really think that's the way you want to? She was so critical. Should we end it on that note? Like, is this really a feminist cry? And I think I said to her, no, it's a human cry. Like, I'm actually putting out a call for humans to really connect with ourselves and to really ask ourselves, are your decisions really your own? How in your life, how many of your decisions are really your own? If you really did a deep dive, you will begin to realize that we're all following the herd in some capacity until you reach a level of consciousness. I'm not saying I'm the Buddha sitting here, okay? I'm not on that level, but I have reached a level of consciousness in my life where I question where my decision making is coming from. That takes work. To even know that you should question why you're doing the thing that you're doing. And I think that's why I wrote the book. And that's what I learned from myself throughout the book, to keep questioning yourself, even as you become an adult and you get older, it doesn't end. The process of self-discovery does not end when you leave school. And so many people, it ends right there.
Loved speaking with you, Cheryl. Yeah, really, really enjoyed this
Is that
conversation.
Time?
It's time, but you can come back. You can come back.
Part two.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
part two.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
That's Cheryl Thompson. She is an assistant professor in the School of Performance at Toronto Metropolitan University. She is the author of Beauty in a Box. Her title, Detangling the Roots of Canada's Black Beauty Culture, as well as the book Uncle, Race, Nostalgia, and the Politics of Loyalty. For more on Cheryl's work and books, please check out our show notes. That's it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support. And you might also be interested in our literary podcast called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram Podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.